High-stakes talks on biodiversity are underway in Montreal, where the UN's COP15 conference opened today. Delegates from across the world are trying to hammer out a deal on a 10-year framework aimed at saving the planet's forests, oceans, and species. The UN is calling the meeting the last best chance to save the planet's ecosystems from irreversible human destruction.
Multinational corporations are filling their bank accounts while emptying our world of its natural gifts. Ecosystems have become playthings of profit. With our bottomless appetite for unchecked and unequal economic growth, humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. We are treating nature like a toilet, and ultimately, we are committing suicide by proxy. Because the loss of nature and biodiversity comes with a steep human cost.
Some strong words there from the UN chief. And for more on this, I'm joined on set by our environment editor, Valerie Dekimpe. Hi, Valerie. So this conference was delayed 4 times. The location changed. What can we expect from the summit now? Will these countries finally get together and hammer out a deal?
Yeah, well, we're looking at a very ambitious goal, Monty, of halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity by 2030. And this deal would need to ensure that there's more nature, more wildlife, more plants by the end of this decade. And the hope is for that goal to be enshrined in a Paris-style accord. In the same way that countries agreed on a landmark deal for the climate, the Paris Agreement to limit warming, well, now we need to see the equivalent but for nature. Now, in Montreal, countries will need to define biodiversity targets for the next 10 years, and this only happens once in a decade. That's why the expectations are really high. And we know that a coalition of more than 100 countries are calling for more than 30% of all land and ocean ecosystems to be protected by 2030. But we know that countries with vast forests like China, Brazil, Indonesia have not yet joined that coalition. Over the next 2 weeks, countries will also discuss more than 20 targets. For example, how to tackle invasive species, curb the use of pesticides, and also reduce the amount of subsidies that are going into activities that actually harm ecosystems. Now, the chances of actually landing a deal, or at least a good deal, are pretty slim. We know that negotiators gathered for talks over the last few days, and they failed to come up with a strong draft for negotiations to begin now in Montreal. We also know that the fact that there's no real leadership driving these talks also doesn't help. The summit was initially scheduled to take place in Kunming, China. It was delayed several times because of COVID. Then Canada offered to host the summit, but tensions have been brewing between the two countries. We know that officially China has not invited any world leaders, and only environment ministers will be attending. So don't count on any world leaders giving a last-minute boost to the negotiations.
It doesn't sound too optimistic. There's obviously a sense of urgency with scientists sounding the alarm over the loss of biodiversity. Have we reached a point of no return?
It feels like it sometimes, because we know that scientists have warned that 1 million species are threatened with extinction. It's the largest loss of species since the dinosaurs were wiped out, according to the UN, and that is why scientists are no longer shying away from talking about a 6th mass extinction. And the thing is that unlike changes to the climate, which could be reversed even if it takes thousands of years, extinctions are permanent, and those extinctions have knock-on effects. For example, all the food that we eat, 95% of the food that we eat comes from the soil, and we know that about 40% of the world's land is severely degraded. We also know that 50% of global GDP depends on healthy ecosystems, and so that is why the stakes are really high. The challenge for this COP as well is for to be a recognition that biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity, and climate disruptions are actually interconnected. They're the two sides of the same coin. So healthy ecosystems protect us from rising temperatures, from extreme weather events. And again, we also know that ecosystems are suffering because of those climate disruptions. The last time countries defined a set of biodiversity targets was back in 2010 in Japan. And the reason why many people are not very optimistic this time around is because none of those targets were met. Every single one of them were not achieved. For example, expanding nature reserves to 17% of the world's surface, or slashing the loss of natural habitats by 50%. A lack of sufficient funds was one of the main reasons why the Aichi targets were not fulfilled. And so finance will be crucial this time around. Countries are calling for $100 billion to be mobilized every single year for biodiversity. That is exactly the same amount that countries should be delivering for the climate every single year. And we know that they have never actually reached that objective. So it is hard to see how that could work in practice for biodiversity.
Certainly some high stakes there in Montreal. Okay, our environment editor, Valerie Dekimpe. Valerie, thanks so much.